Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started with our final panel of the meeting, which will examine and assess U.S. nuclear weapons spending plans and the associated requirements that sustain them. My name is Kingston Reef. I'm the Director for Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy here at the Arms Control Association. As most of you in the room know, the United States is planning to rebuild all three legs of the nuclear triad and their associated warheads and supporting infrastructure over roughly the next 25 years. The Pentagon estimates this modernization effort will cost between $350 and $450 billion with a B. Indeed, the mammoth costs of nuclear modernization prompted Republican Senator and Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John McCain to utter the following last month, quote, "It's very, very, very expensive. Do we really need the entire triad given the situation?" End quote. Now, for the uninitiated among you in the room, questioning the need for the nuclear triad borders on blasphemy in this town, which makes McCain's comments all the more of a take notice moment. Likewise, the Republican-led House Appropriations Committee declared in legislation last month that the cost of nuclear modernization, quote, presents an enormous affordability challenge. President Obama has acknowledged that existing U.S. and global nuclear weapons capabilities are already more than enough, yet his administration is pursuing a costly, all-of-the-above plan to maintain and upgrade U.S. nuclear forces at force levels that exceed deterrence requirements. In fact, nearly every nuclear-armed state is engaged in a costly, multi-decade effort to modernize and improve the capability of their nuclear weapons and delivery systems. In addition, there are currently no active bilateral or multilateral negotiations to further regulate, cap, or reduce the stockpiles of any of the world's nuclear-armed states. This situation has raised concerns that the world stands on the brink of a new nuclear arms race. Not a numerical arms race, but one toward increasingly more advanced nuclear capabilities that could undermine stability and increase the chances of nuclear weapons use. For its part, the Obama administration appears satisfied to pass on the challenges associated with nuclear modernization to its successor, though we just heard from Ben Rhodes that the plans were put together in a different budget environment and are continually under review. So watch that space over the next 7 months. But regardless of what happens during the remainder of the Obama administration, the next president will likely be faced with a number of increasingly urgent questions about America's nuclear modernization project, including its affordability, opportunity costs, impact on global stability, and more. Here at the Arms Control Association, we have for years been raising warning sirens about the costs and necessity of the modernization plans, and have suggested a number of steps that could be taken to put the plans on a more sustainable course. Today, we're happy to continue our engagement with 4 of the country's leading experts on this issue. To my right is Mark Kansian, a senior advisor with the CSIS International Security Program. He joined CSIS in April 2015 from the Office of Management and Budget, where he spent more than 7 years as chief of the Force Structure and Investment Division. Next to Mark is Amy Wolf, a specialist in nuclear weapons policy in the Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division of the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress, and arguably the planet's leading authority on U.S. nuclear strategy. Our third speaker will be Andrew Weber, a non-resident senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Andy served 30 years in the U.S. government, including from 2009 to 2014 as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, and also as Staff Director of the Nuclear Weapons Council. And our final speaker will be Hans Christensen. Hans is Director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Mark, Andy, Hans, and Amy will each provide about 10 minutes of open remarks in the order that I've introduced them. I've asked Mark to outline the scope of the current nuclear weapons spending plans, the budget challenge they will pose to the next president, and suggest any lessons that the previous Carter and Reagan-era nuclear modernization experience teaches us about the coming modernization bow wave. Amy will next provide an overview of the options available to the next president to pay for or adjust the plans and the associated requirements and operational changes and policy changes this would require. And of course, in the best traditions of the Congressional Research Service, Amy will do so without in any way, shape, or form issuing any opinions on the matter before us today. Andrew will provide his thoughts on the feasibility of the modernization plans and recommendations for the next president regarding possible adjustments to the plans. And finally, Hans will highlight the degree to which U.S. nuclear modernization is improving or will improve the capability of the modernized forces and the implications of these plans for strategic stability. With that, Mark, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope you all have the handouts that were sent around, because when you talk about budget matters, it's very helpful to have charts to refer to. Plus, I spent many years in the Pentagon, and after a while, you lose the ability to speak without the use of PowerPoint, so you'll have to bear with me on that. I'm going to talk about three topics today. First is the defense budget overall, then the budget for nuclear forces, and finally the environment going forward, the challenges to funding nuclear forces. And I'm going to march the charts pretty quickly. If you have questions, feel free to ask me during the Q&A session, or come on up afterwards. The first chart there, the first two charts give some historical context, and I think they're old news for many of you, so I'll go through them quickly. The first one shows DoD funding over the last 70 years, and I just want to make 3 points on the chart. The first is the cyclic nature of defense spending. You can see it goes up during times of war and crisis, and then comes down when the war or crisis is over. The second is that the peak that we recently experienced is much higher than the previous peaks. And the third is that the current decline appears to have stopped. So we appear to have hit a valley here, and it's a valley that's higher than the previous levels, previous historical levels. The next chart looks at defense spending as a percentage of GDP, and that's a good measure of burden. Here you have both the defense spending and the denominator, the size of the U.S. economy, and there are 2 points that become apparent here. That become apparent. I mean, the first is you see the same peak and valleys that you saw in the previous chart. The burden goes up during periods of war and crisis, and then comes down afterwards. But the second one is that long term, the burden has been coming down from very high levels during the 50s and into the 60s, and then declining since then. The next chart, slide 4, shows recent fiscal projections, and it's a closer look at the recent turbulent budget history that we've experienced. The solid black line is the enacted budget level, and the other lines are successive forecasts that the administration has made about future funding. The top line there is the Gates budget projection. That was made by Secretary Gates before the Budget Control Act, and that was the level he considered to be the minimum required to execute the strategy. And you see reference to that sometimes from defense hawks who would like to get back to that level as a fully funded defense effort. After that, you can see the effect of the Budget Control Act of 2011. The defense budget goes down quite steeply. First, they had to take out about $480 billion, $487 billion over 10 years. And then the successive projections, which indicate the inability to make a budget deal and the continuing threats about sequestration. One interesting note is that the projections seem to have turned around. If you take a look at the line with the boxes on it, that's the most recent projection by the administration, and it's higher than the earlier projection last year. So that indicates, maybe a consensus that's building in the Congress, I think in the broader public and the administration, that if you want to execute the strategy that the administration has articulated, then you're going to have to put more money in. The next chart, this is the one that's FY 2017 FYDP, that's Future Year Defense Plan, compared to budget caps and budget deals. And I don't want to go into all the details of the individual budget deals, but I just want to make the point that our experience has been a series of short-term budget agreements between the Congress and the President. these deals have been at a level between the Sequestration or Budget Control Act level and what the president has been requesting. So if you had to make a guess about what the future is going to look like, you'd say, well, that pattern will probably continue. That is, that it won't go down as far as the Budget Control Act, but it may not be quite as high as the president has requested. Now, of course, there's going to be an election in November, so next year could be very different. You could see some sort of discontinuity. That's very hard to predict, but if the past is any indicator, we'll end up somewhere between the two. But now I want to talk a little about nuclear budgets. And this is the chart that says nuclear forces spending. Nuclear forces haven't been a budget issue for a long time. And the reason is that nuclear forces are very capital intensive. And once you've bought them, they're relatively inexpensive to maintain and sustain. But with the coming bow wave that we'll talk about in a minute, that's about to change. And I think that nuclear forces will again be a budget issue. If you look at the solid line there, you can see what's happened in the past, and that is that these nuclear modernizations have come cyclically. There was one set in the early 1960s. You can see that very high level on the left, and then there's another bump up during the Reagan years, and now we're heading towards another. The other point I want to make is that there are different ways to count. The line there shows what the Department of Defense calls MFP1, that's Major Force Program 1, Strategic Forces, and it's probably the narrowest definition of spending on nuclear forces. It really picks up only the direct costs, but because the department has published those costs, very often those are the ones they used. If you look at the dots that are sort of on the right-hand side of the chart there, that shows what happens if you add in successively additional elements of nuclear costs. The first dot picks up a lot of dual-use systems like tankers, aerial tankers. The next dot picks up the nuclear pieces of the Department of Energy, and then the final dot picks up a lot of non-weapons nuclear activities like cleanup and like non-proliferation. The next slide talks about modernization programs. And in the top left there, you see the big 5 modernization programs. I know that other panelists are going to talk about those in detail, so I won't. I'll just note that the first 2, the bomber and the submarine, are likely to be $100 billion programs. I mean, these are very major fiscal commitments. I also want to discuss something that doesn't really get a lot of attention, and that's on the box in the lower right, and that's the funding for NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration. Because of the way the budget caps are constructed, NNSA and DoD fall within the same cap. And what that means in the budget world is if you want to give an extra dollar to NNSA for nuclear weapons, or for naval reactors, or for nonproliferation, you have to take it away from DoD. And that sets up a budget dynamic that, from a budgeteer's point of view, is actually very attractive, because it means you have a discussion about what's more important. Is it more important to put a dollar here or a dollar here? But it also means that you have a sort of 2 scorpions in the bottle kind of dynamic, and that the 2 departments have to argue about whose requirement is more important. For a number of years, when NNSA had cost overruns on many of their programs, they had to come back to DoD and ask for more money. DoD became increasingly reluctant to give them more money, arguing that NNSA had not scrubbed its budget the same way that DoD had, and therefore should go back and find offsets internally. I think that dynamic is going to continue, and I think periodically it breaks out into the public. And the reason it's going to continue is the bullets that I list in the box there. Secretary Muniz has gone out with a letter, which he sent over to OMB, saying that there are a lot of additional costs that are coming for NNSA that he's going to need additional funds for in the future. So what that will mean is, as those costs become manifest, the money will have to come from DoD, and there's going to be I think, a very sharp disagreement there. On the next slide there. Now we get to the bow wave. The individual bars there you can see are the fiscal demands by year. This chart comes out of a study that was done by one of my colleagues, Todd Harrison. You can see the reference there. And I circled the 2 years that you see the major increase in fiscal demands, sort of 20 and 21. Those are also inside the department's 5-year plan. So the department is having to start making some trade-offs to accommodate those fiscal demands. I'd also note that the nuclear bow wave is not the only set of demands the department's going to have to face. There are increasing demands for personnel costs, modernization of the conventional forces, because the way that Todd did his chart here, it does not include most of the cost of the bombers, for example, because he argued that that was mostly a conventional capability. And there's a whole bunch of conventional modernization programs that are going to make demands on the department. Plus, you've got increases in the O&M funding, the operations and maintenance, which goes up every year, and possibly an end to the war funding, which has provided a safety valve to the department. So the nuclear bow wave will hit at the same time that the department will be under other fiscal pressures. Then on the last chart, you can see the burden that will put onto the department. Now, on one level, you can argue that it's not that large an increase. It goes from about 3% of the department's budget to about 5%. Not a huge increase in itself, and you could accommodate it with some trade-offs with other programs. Trade-offs are always very painful, but it certainly could be done. And if the department is committed to the nuclear modernization programs, then it could cut other programs to find the funding. My wife and I have these conversations all the time. We can afford anything, we just can't afford everything. And the department's in the same position. It also depends on what happens to the top line. If you look back in the 60s, the modernization then, and then the modernization under Reagan, the top line went up, so the department was able to accommodate its nuclear modernization program in an environment of increasing resources, so it was not having to take resources from other programs. And if indeed the budget turns around, the department may be able to do that, but if the budget environment continues to, as it has for the last couple of years, then it's going to have to make some, I think, very difficult trade-offs. And my personal guess is that when those trade-offs start to become apparent, you're going to see a lot more discussion about options on the nuclear programs. So far, they haven't made that many fiscal demands. They haven't had to make a lot of trade-offs. So they've sort of come in under the radar, so to speak. But I think when you start making those trade-offs, people are going to start asking some tough questions about programs. The bomber, for example, does it really need to be a penetrating bomber? Can't it be a standoff bomber? Those sorts of things. And I'll leave that to my other panelists.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I should have mentioned that we did distribute the slides that I see all of you were going through for Mark's presentation. And then you also have slides for Hans's presentation as well. Amy.
Thank you. Ignore everything that Kingston said. I'd like to thank Kingston and Daryl and the Arms Control Association for inviting me. And yes, as a CRS analyst, I offer no opinions and will just provide facts and figures. But in the off chance that an opinion sneaks out, just attribute it to me as the person, not to CRS. That'll cover me since we're on camera. I was going to start by sketching out a bow wave with my finger, and I don't have to do that because you have Todd Harrison's bow waves in front of you. You may want to keep those open. And I'm going to pick up exactly where we just ended. When the trade-offs come in the 2020s, what are the options for the next administration to basically flatten out or extend or eliminate the bow wave, given that it's not really a nuclear weapons problem, it's a Pentagon-wide problem? What do I mean by that? As we buy 12 new Ohio-class replacement submarines, the Navy also wants to buy a bunch of other ships, including aircraft carriers and LCSs. And they have to, within their shipbuilding budget, make trade-offs between those programs. As the Air Force buys a new bomber, be it conventional nuclear penetrating or not, it also wants to buy tankers and F-35 aircraft. And as the Air Force buys ICBMs and cruise missiles, it needs to do it under the same budget ceiling as the bombers, the tankers, and the F-35s. So this bow wave problem isn't just nuclear. It is across the Pentagon. There are going to be huge production and procurement bills to pay beginning mid to late 2020s, and the nuclear programs are in that mix. So what Kingston asked me to address is what choices could you make to get in under that bow wave, to reduce it or stretch it out. And since you have the pictures here, I don't have to draw a bow wave. There are generally three analytic ways to address the fact that you're going to be planning to spend more than your budget's going to allow you to spend. And each of them has benefits and costs, and each of them has implications for the nuclear force. First one, obviously, you can delay the program or delay several of the programs, sequence them out better so that you don't all try to buy your stuff between 2025 and 2027. And if you buy some sooner and some later, then you've taken that peak and flattened it out a bit. You may have stretched it, but you flattened it, so you get in under your budget. That would seem to make sense, except for within the nuclear program, the reason they're buying everything now or in the next 10 years is because the things we have are getting old. And the reasoning goes within the Pentagon that at some point the old stuff is going to introduce risk into your capabilities or even damage or danger into your capabilities. You have submarines that are approaching the end of their service lives. You can't get them much past 42 years because they have nuclear reactors on them. You've already refueled the reactor. It's going to run out of fuel the second time. That hull has to go underwater and come back up. There are risks to keeping them around too long. There are also costs. We've replaced most of the pieces and parts on the land-based missiles. You'd go through another round of replacing pieces and parts on 30-year-old missiles, and that actually costs a lot. Maybe not as much as a new missile, but there are costs. So the Pentagon would tell you the reason we're buying these things all in the next 10 or 15 years is because the ones we have are aging out, at least for most of them. So if you try and delay them or sequence them, you may get to the point where the people in the place who have to make these decisions say, you're introducing risk. And you're also undermining the capability to meet the requirements. If you introduce risk into your submarine force by reducing below the 12 or 14 submarines we have now, the Navy would tell you, but then we can't operate the way we operate now, and we have a requirement to meet our needs by operating the way we have to operate now. It's not a budget decision. It's not a decision made using arithmetic. It's an operational decision. So stretching programs out or sequencing them better would have implications for the Pentagon in how it thinks about how it needs to operate its force. Second reason you could stretch the programs out, but as any good budgeteer would tell you, the longer you take to build a program, the more it's going to cost. There's some increment of funding for 10% that you'll add to the total cost of the program by making it go slower. Now, if you're trying to fit into your budget for the next year, or you fit up in the Pentagon for the next 5 years, you don't worry about that. Stretching it out gets those numbers, you flatten that bow wave, you get in under your ceiling now, and you worry about the long-term cost later. There's a technical term for that, muddling through. That's another option. You can slow these things down. So instead of buying your bombers at a pace to get you all the bombers you need in the early 2030s, you could slow them down. And from the nuclear weapons community's perspective, that's fine because the B-52s and the B-2s are both slated to be around till 2030 or 2040. So slowing down the new bomber probably wouldn't undermine your nuclear mission. On the other hand, the Air Force will tell you it needs those bombers to meet conventional penetrating missions in an A2AD environment. So once again, your arithmetic solution interferes with your operations and meeting your requirements. I'm not arguing that those operations and requirements are set in stone, but just for now, bear with me, they exist. The third way to address this overwhelming problem of too much money spent and not enough in the budget is to truncate your programs, buy fewer of them. So instead of buying 400 new ICBMs, 1,000 new ICBMs to fill out a force of 400 ICBMs, or 12 new submarines to fill out 2 bases, or 80 to 100 new bombers, you could buy fewer. But if you're looking at getting in under the bow wave in the next 10 years, buying fewer items or truncating your program doesn't save you money till the out years. So if you're the person in Congress or the person in the Pentagon trying to fit the program in under your budget this year or your fit up in the next 5 years, truncating the program doesn't help you. On the other hand, truncating the program is something we do often, particularly in the nuclear world. When I started working at CRS, years ago, we were planning to buy between 21 and 24 Ohio-class submarines. Within a year of when I got there, we planned to buy 18, we planned to buy 21, then we planned to buy 18, and we now have 14 in the nuclear force and 4 in the SSGN force. So the numbers in the out years change. Anybody remember when we planned to buy 132 B-2 bombers until the price tag came out of the black? And then the president at the time reduced it to 75 until the Cold War ended, and now it's 21. Well, it's 20 because we've lost one. So truncating a program happens often, but it doesn't solve your near-term budget problems. The point I'm trying to make here is that we don't size and structure our nuclear force using budget arithmetic or any arithmetic on the back of an envelope. The Pentagon, when it tells the president, tells OMB what it wants, it's trying to meet a set of requirements. And the requirements determine the size and timing of the force structure and the operations of the force structure. So even though someone in the arms control community could sit down and say, okay, New START gives us 1,550 warheads, and I want to spread those on, let's say, 300 ICBMs instead of 400, and 8 submarines instead of 12, I can do that. I can make the math work. But it doesn't meet the Pentagon's needs to meet its requirements. What requirements am I talking about? The requirements to maintain a continuous at-sea deterrent out of 2 oceans. So submarines on station, ready to meet their deterrent roles from both Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington. If you reduce the number of submarines, you interfere with the Pentagon's ability to operate its forces the way they do now and meet those requirements. Those requirements, like I said, are not necessarily set in stone. They can change. But you would prefer that a question of what our requirements should be, what the role of our nuclear weapons are, and what the mission and the mechanism that we use to meet that role, that were made first, and then the budget came after. If you cut the force to meet a budgetary need and can't meet your requirements, you may force a less coherent change in requirements. So wouldn't it be nice to do it front end to back? As I said, there's a technical term for the way we do it. It's muddling through. We rarely do it front end to back. But one would think that one would want to decide what the requirements and needs are and then size the force accordingly if you can't afford the force you're planning to meet your current requirements. Now, there are 2 other ways to solve this bow wave problem. One of them, as you just heard, is you can raise the top line in the budget. So I'm going to ask anyone in this room who thinks we're spending too much money on nuclear weapons because we can't afford it with everything else we want to be buying, would you be okay if we raise the top line of the budget? You want to buy the nuclear stuff then? No. Is there anyone in the room who would want to do that? No. It's not a monetary issue for you. Same thing. You want to cancel some of the programs because they cost too much money? Really? If they were free, would you still want to cancel them? Probably. I think I just proved you're not having a debate about how much they cost. You're having a debate about how much they're worth. And that, again, is an issue of the roles, missions, and requirements for nuclear weapons. And that is the discussion that the Obama administration had during its first few years in office when they did a nuclear posture review, when they came up with the limits and the plans for under New START. But then the discussion changed in November of 2011 when Congress passed the Budget Control Act. So now we are having a discussion about how much these weapons cost and how we can't afford them under the ceiling set by the Budget Control Act. But ask yourself whether you want to keep having that conversation or you want to go back to having a conversation about how much they're worth, what the roles and missions are. I recognize that that's a more difficult conversation, but if you continue thinking you want to have the conversation about how much they cost, you have to recognize that the people who feel differently from you look at the last chart that's in your packet from before, and they only cost 5% of the defense budget. Is that so awful? To which one would say, there are opportunity costs, there are trade-offs, there are priorities. The problem is not that they cost a huge portion of the defense budget. It's that for those people who don't believe we ought to be pursuing these programs, you don't want to put your priority for your dollars on nuclear weapons programs for other reasons, not because of cost reasons. For those people who do want to pursue the modernization programs, they do want to put their priority on nuclear weapons programs, regardless of the cost. If you're going to have that discussion at the beginning of the next administration, and you continue to have the discussion based on how much these weapons cost, rather than how much they're worth, you're not going to make any progress in the debate. If you haven't noticed, that debate's been going on for 5 years. If it requires getting back to a discussion of what they're worth, you may have the ability to find some range of opinion on both sides of the debate where you could come to some conclusions. The next administration is going to have to address this, how much they're worth question, figure out how much they can afford to spend. But I want to remind you, even though you've asked this panel to talk about costs, I'm really talking about what they're worth.
Excellent. Thanks, Amy. Andy.
Like Amy, I get to have things. Right. This is about what they're worth and what we need for a safe, secure, and effective deterrent. I was heartened by Ben Rhodes' comments. Indeed, without having heard them, I arranged my talk in sort of 2 buckets. One is, what can the Obama administration still do to push through the tape in the next 7 months? That's a term that President Obama uses frequently, and it's a track term for those who haven't heard it before. But there's a lot he can do. So that's the first bucket. I call it sort of low-hanging fruit, good stewardship, not leaving a mess for your successors. And then I have some longer-term things that the next administration can work on. And certainly President Obama has a good opportunity to lay the foundation for that. But first, I want to do what is rarely done, and that is take credit for what the Obama administration has done to ensure a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. I was part of that, and I'm very proud of what we did. I think the neglect of the previous decade has been reversed. We have in full production the W76-1 warhead, and that program will be finished in 2019. So the heart of our deterrent, which is the sea leg, will be in very good shape. We made a decision to do a limited life extension program, including replacing the conventional high explosive on the W88, the other sea-launched ballistic missile. So our sea leg warhead situation is in very good shape. We have the Ohio-class replacement program. It's also on a very good path. The big question for that is not, do we need them? It's how many do we need? And the savings, whether you buy 12 boats or 10 boats or 8 boats, those savings won't be realized until the 2040s, 2050s, a long way away. There may be some savings if you slip the start, which I do not favor. The investments in the nuclear command and control with command and control system have been significantly enhanced, and without good NC2, we don't have nuclear weapons. We can have thousands of them, but without that good, reliable command and control system, positive control by the president, we don't have a good, safe, secure, and effective deterrent. And then the B-21 to replace the B-52 and eventually the B-2 is a good investment. I support the new bomber, and that program is on a very good path. It's now in early procurement phases or final development and testing phases. And we need a new bomber, and I support that. Do we need 60 or 100? That's a discussion worth having. Had we built 60 B-2s, we would have retired the B-52 and the air-launched cruise missile 20, 30 years ago. That's our new start force structure, is 60 nuclear-capable bombers. If we had 60 B-2s, we wouldn't need the B-52 or the Alchem today. So with those significant, sustained, steady efforts supported on a bipartisan basis by Congress, our deterrent is on a good path. And I think the administration deserves great credit for that. It may not be something that everybody in this room wants to hear, but it's something that I believe very deeply. So now let me talk about some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the easier changes that could be made in the next 7 months. And Amy talked about requirements, and that's the right place to start. It's what is the deterrent that we need going forward? We also need to think about how our modernization investments are viewed around the world and what counter-investments will they spur. So that's something we don't do very well. The requirements for nuclear weapons are made by one individual, the President of the United States. It's unlike every other weapon system where they are derived through this process that the Pentagon calls the requirements process. These are set by the President. And if you look at an amazing case study in history, the 1991 presidential nuclear initiatives that George Herbert Walker Bush and General Scowcroft led together with Colin Powell, in 3 weeks, they changed the requirements for nuclear weapons and then implemented that. And it just takes a stroke of the pen because the president himself can determine and does determine the requirements for nuclear weapons. It's a great case study, and it's on the NDU website. Susan Cook, K-O-C-H, wrote it, and I recommend it as a good example of what can be done in a very short time. Now, the easiest change that the president could make today is to retire immediately a weapon that nobody talks about, and that's the B-83 gravity bomb. It has a yield of over 1 megaton. There's no legitimate use for this today, and we have in the B-2, we have the B-61 gravity bomb today, and we're consolidating 4 different models into the B-61-12, so we have a replacement planned. So we don't need that, and we could save money. Just keeping these things around costs money, $30, $40 billion a year just to have them. And over time, that adds up to real money. It would also, after the visit to Hiroshima, show that we don't need nuclear weapons in the megaton plus range of yield. Another one that I consider low-hanging fruit is the replacement to the air-launched cruise missile, known euphemistically as the LRSO. I think it stands for the long-range strike option, but it's a new nuclear weapons system that is planned to replace the Alchem. The Alchem today only flies on the B-52, so this penetrating nuclear missile would be combined with the penetrating bombers. It's planned to be on the B-2 as well as the B-21, as well as the B-52, and it's more than we need, frankly. It's about to enter milestone A, and once it becomes a program, its jobs, its the constituency, very hard to stop. So I think at a minimum, the president should not box in his successor and should put a 1-year delay on that program and make it part of the next administration's nuclear posture review. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review report said on the issue of replacing the Alchem, the decision will be made whether, comma, and if so, how, comma, to replace the air-launched cruise missile. And I think that needs to be a considered decision. But the new B-61-12 gravity bomb, combined with the new stealth bomber, gives our air leg for many, many, many decades to come a formidable, makes our air leg a formidable part of the deterrent, indeed more formidable than today's bomber leg of the triad. That would be without replacing the air-launched cruise missile. So it's not a disarmament step. Indeed, it's just investing in what we need to have a safe, secure, effective, and sustainable air leg of our triad. On the ICBM side, we've already done the work. We know we can retire a wing of ICBMs and go down to 300 without having an impact on our nuclear deterrent. It's a political problem. I wouldn't do it piecemeal. I would suggest closing down the wing at Minot Air Force Base. It wouldn't require closing that base because the B-52s in the nuclear mission also reside there. And the economy in North Dakota is doing quite well with shale gas, so it's not as big an issue there as it is in the other states of Wyoming and Montana. We have two warheads in the ICBM leg, the W-87, which is modern, it's in good shape, and the W-78, which I think we could make a decision easily not to replace that going forward. This 3+2 plan in the Jason's report was made public last week. And Kingston wrote a nice piece about that, but it's not viable and it's not necessary. So we need to reconsider that and not make it the longer term plan. I think I'll just close by saying that nuclear arms control is about improving our national security. It's about increasing stability. It's about lowering the risk of use of nuclear weapons. Just because we've had 70 years of no use of nuclear weapons doesn't mean we can assume that we'll have another 70. And this is why Bill Perry and I have recommended that the president not start the LRSO program, because we believe that nuclear-armed cruise missiles, sea, air, and ground-launched nuclear-armed cruise missiles are the most destabilizing type of nuclear weapons. And we believe the president can make a Nobel-worthy move by canceling this program and working with the world on a global, multilateral, an omnilateral prohibition on all nuclear-armed cruise missiles. And the writings pro and con on that are at nuclearcruisemissiles.com. You can read all that's been written in the last 6 months since Secretary Perry and I wrote an op-ed piece recommending that the president pursue a global prohibition on nuclear-armed cruise missiles. So finally, I just want to give a challenge to you. This lull in arms control that Susan Burke described, this despondency because we don't have a partner in Vladimir Putin. We need to sort of wake ourselves out of this slumber and be creative, be innovative. Let's do some original arms control thinking. Let's get ourselves out of everything has to be bilateral with Russia. It takes two to tango. Maybe square dancing is a better analogy. But we have to bring the Chinese into this discussion. And it's hard to have a conversation about numbers because they're still in the low hundreds and we in Russia are in the many, many thousands. But perhaps we could have a discussion about types, and especially this destabilizing type of nuclear-armed cruise missiles. Even more so, and Hans, I think, will mention this, because this administration is procuring a new air-launched cruise missile that's conventional only, called the JASSM Extended Range, that fulfills that mission without having a nuclear warhead. So thank you, and I look forward to some hard questions from this audience.
Thanks, Andy. Before going to Hans, I should just clarify that it was Stephen Young who wrote that wonderful piece on the so-called 3+2 plan.
Kingston will write another one.
Over to you, Hans, and I'm going to count on you, Hans, to stay slightly under your time since we've gone a little over.
All right, so I'll chop a little, but we don't have this briefing slide projector here, so we've distributed the slides, and if you don't get them, have them, you can get them from our website. So obviously the Obama administration, I'll cut this short in the interest of time. So I won't go into all the details or issues in the slides. But I just want to say here that obviously the Obama administration has made some progress on reducing the numbers and the role of nuclear weapons. We can discuss how successful it's been or not, and whether the efforts and the outcome has been sufficient. And I don't think it's been, but that's another matter. But there's a curious thing that has been going on even from before the Obama administration, and that is as we have reduced nuclear weapons, we have reduced weapons more than we have reduced the mission, so to speak. So this has created, in my view, a dilemma for the planners, the military planners, that they have to do, if not more, but then certainly almost as much with less. And so from that inherent conflict, I think, comes a temptation, almost a requirement, to improve the capabilities of the weapons that remain. This is not a question about building an entire new weapon or something like that, because we have a policy that we shouldn't do that. Obama, when he came in, he gave a policy statement the White House put out in the context of the Nuclear Posture Review, a page where they said, among other things, the United States will not develop new nuclear warheads or pursue new military missions or new military capabilities for nuclear weapons. Relatively clear statement, which is actually three policies in one statement. The NPR formulation was a little different, tied it more directly to the life extension programs. Nonetheless, it's still somewhat unclear what is meant by new military missions or new military capabilities. Because, of course, we have nuclear weapons, so why would another nuclear weapon be a new military capability? I mean, you can stretch it any which way you want. But what I've seen is that in our life extension programs, we appear to incorporate enhanced capabilities. And this may not be something terribly surprising. I mean, what nuclear weapon state has ever modernized its nuclear arsenal and not improved the capabilities? That seems to be sort of part of the game. The issue is that now we have a policy that says we won't do it. And so what's also changed is that, compared to the past, conventional forces have evolved tremendously. And when it comes to the issue of holding targets at risk, which is the foundation, of course, of deterrent, then we are in a different era where we can make choices about whether some nuclear weapons are needed and some are not. And this is also not an entirely new thing. The Navy has completely moved out of the nuclear business because, well, conventional weapons became so good that you didn't have to have them anymore. You didn't have to have nuclear weapons for anti-submarine, anti-air, you name it. I mean, we used to have nuclear weapons on the back of a Jeep, nuclear torpedoes. So the point is just here that there is a military revolution that's been going on for the last several decades that provides new opportunities to change course. The first one that was already underway when Obama came in, that was the life extension of the W-76 warhead, the one of the two you already mentioned. And of course, this is not a new warhead. It's very close to the original design. So that's not where the change is. Instead, the change is in the fuse of the reentry body. That gives this warhead a capability to sense where it is, and as it approaches its target, adjust where the detonation will happen. And as far as we can see, this will increase the weapon's targeting capability very significantly. This is not an entirely new capability. We already had that capability on the W-88 warhead, the other Navy, which was why that was so efficient and accurate. But on this W-76, that is now halfway through, and they started deploying it on the submarines, I think pretty much the same year that Obama took office, 2009. We're halfway through the production, or a little over halfway through the production right now, and Andy mentioned that it's going to be over in 2019. And then there will be a warhead in there for the next, 30 years, I guess, for the submarines. But it will be a different warhead than the one that was there before. And so for me, what's striking is that now, unlike during the Cold War, in the future, the majority of the U.S. hard target kill capability will be at sea, not on land, not on ICBMs, but at sea on the submarines. And this raises some real questions about strategic stability, how adversaries will view the threat, what they have to do to take this and that into consideration. So this is a new, I think, important factor we have to think about. The first weapon that Obama took care of was the B-61, of course, also mentioned before, merging capabilities from several different warheads. And out comes this new device that we call a 2-minute warning, all right, that we call not a new weapon. But if you look at the pictures, it's very clear that this is a new weapon. It has a new tail kit that we don't have on other gravity bombs. It's the first guided nuclear gravity bomb in the U.S. arsenal. With that comes enhanced capabilities. And the most important to me is that it's an incorporation of all the military capabilities from gravity bombs into one system. That's been the objective. But this opens new issues such as the use of greater accuracy to try to reduce radioactive fallout during attack. And for most people, they would say, yeah, well, that sounds reasonable. We don't want to rain radioactive fallout over civilians. But it also raises a number of issues about the perception of what we are up to in terms of the way we think about the potential. Something that's important to think about. We have made some calculations. You can look at it, the slide. The air-launched cruise missile, the LRSO, much more a straightforward case, I think, about significant military capabilities than the B-6112 is. Not only in terms of range, but most importantly, I think, in terms of the missile's own stealth, but also the fact that this is going to be incorporated on stealth bombers for the first time. We have not had nuclear cruise missiles incorporated onto stealth bombers in the past. They've been on the old clunkers, the B-52s. This is going to be different now. And not only will they not only be on one type of aircraft, they'll be on all the heavy bombers. And so the future heavy bombers, the B-2 and the B-21. So to me, that's a significant change in the capability. We can discuss the nuances of it and what have you. But let me just end by saying, I think of all, you said a little about this, Andy, also, of course, that this is a low-hanging fruit in my view, because I think what really strikes me is that when the air-launched cruise missile was developed back in the 70s, there were no long-range, accurate conventional cruise missiles. They didn't exist. Today we have an enormous inventory of this, and it is evolving as we speak. The JASSM extended range that's being deployed, the Navy's coming in with the long-range anti-ship cruise missile version of the JASSM. The Navy already has the Tomahawk, tactical Tomahawk. There will be other versions coming in, and this will be on everything, not just bombers. It'll go on some of the fighter aircraft as well. It'll be a very, very, very broad deployment. So this is a significant new capability that is being added to the arsenal, non-nuclear. And so I think this gives the president a real opportunity to do what he said he would do, which is to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And as the 2013 nuclear employment guidance said, asked the Pentagon to examine ways we can increase the role of non-nuclear weapons in traditional nuclear planning. This is such an opportunity. I just want to finish, I know I've been stretching it here, by saying I think all the other nuclear weapon states are modernizing as well. I mean, so this is a very difficult issue. There's a tendency in the debate to say, well, the Russians are doing it, and the Chinese are doing it, and and therefore we must too. But I think we have to think more cool-headedly about what are our requirements and what is the right structure of our posture in doing these things. Because I think it's not just about the posture itself. It's also about the type of foundation that we intend to lay for the next 3 decades. The next 3 decades in how we will interact with the other nuclear weapon state. And if the message at the outset is, well, we're pretty much going to do it the way we did in the past. We're going to incorporate some new capabilities, lower numbers, yeah, but, it's going to be a better force in the future, leaner but meaner. Then I think it's going to be very hard to realize the Obama administration's vision about significantly reduce the role of nuclear weapons, the numbers, and certainly moving toward a world without them.
Thanks very much, Hans. Thanks to our speakers for those excellent remarks. We have just shy of 15 minutes for questions before Daryl will close us out. What I'm going to do is take 3 to 4 questions at a time, and then ask our speakers to, as briefly as possible, address the question most relevant to your remarks that was asked of you. Mics are going around the room. If you could please identify yourself and your affiliation. Start here, right in the front. Yes, sir.
Bob Sherman, just speaking as Joe Q. citizen. Question for Andy. I'm going to throw out 2 propositions. You tell me if you disagree with them. Number 1, deterrence is solely a matter of what is in the mind of the deterree. If the other side's leader feels deterred, we have deterrence. If not, we don't. Questions such as, what is our actual capability? How do we feel about it? That may feed into what is in the other guy's mind. But at the bottom line, what counts is what's in his mind. Number 2, even Putin at his craziest has not said anything to indicate that he regards the U.S. deterrent as anything less than hyper-sufficient.
Thanks, Bob. Other questions? Right there in the red. Right back here, Marissa. Got it.
Stephanie Cook from Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. And this would be a question for Hans and also maybe Andy or any of you. But from what you were saying, Hans, are you sort of seeing that this move toward these weapons that are lower yield, kind of that sort of blur the line between conventional and nuclear, is a kind of necessary step towards actually getting to the point where we don't have nuclear weapons? Or I mean, it strikes me as a kind of very hairy proposition for the next 3 decades if we can make it through without a nuclear war, but that's a really big if. And is it likely to lead other countries to go in this direction? But mainly, is it a kind of transit? Do you see it as a sort of transitional phase or something that could lead us into a nuclear war, or both? That makes sense.
Any other questions? And then right here. Yep.
Would the move to a policy that nuclear weapons are only used for deterrence of a nuclear attack, which is what the president said we were getting to but hadn't gotten to yet, would that change our requirements at all and lead maybe to the not have the need for some of these weapons? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Andy, the first question was to you, then Hans, the second one, and Amy, why don't you take on the last question?
I'd like to add a comment to the last question, but the first question, yes, deterrence is based on credibility, and it's what is in the mind of your potential adversary to prevent them, or to deter them, to prevent them from acting or using nuclear weapons. I'm not sure Putin, before he's had breakfast on a given day, knows what's in his own mind, so it's hard to figure that out. But even paranoids have enemies, and we need to do a much better job than we do in understanding how our investments are perceived in Beijing, in Moscow, in Berlin. And we're really terrible at that. And I know because as staff director of the Nuclear Weapons Council that makes these investment decisions, we rarely, if ever, even talked about that aspect. So I think, one of the reasons that Secretary Perry and I think that this new LRSO with a new military capability, because of the combination with a penetrating missile, penetrating bomber we've never had, how does that look in Beijing? Just because we know we would never think about a first strike, because that's not our policy, doesn't mean that they're not thinking that, well, if the U.S. were to deliver a first strike, that would be a pretty good capability. So at the end of the day, we have the safe, secure, and effective deterrent that I support is the deterrent that we judge on the merits that we need to have credibility. And we are in the best position in our history. We have the best military we've ever had, nuclear and conventional, and nobody in the Pentagon would trade our nuclear weapons capability with that of any other country today.
Thanks, Andy. Hans.
So it's important to understand that the B-61 warhead does not have new military capabilities. It does not have lower yields than any other weapons we currently have in the arsenal. It's not the warhead. It's the tail kit, stupid. That's kind of the essence of this. This is about how can you use the weapon. So it's not that they're not fiddling with the warhead in that sense. So that's important to clear up. By getting better accuracy, you get different options to hold targets at risk with lower yields. And it's quite significant, actually. And we could see even some of the videos that came out recently that from one of the drop tests that apparently it also has some underground capability, earth penetrating capability. I mean, 800 pounds is bound to go in to some extent if you drop it from an aircraft, but it might have. I mean, if we're supposed to have this one weapon that leads us to, retire all the other gravity weapons, then obviously we'll have to have some capability to detonate just below the surface. You may not have to go as deep as the B-61 level. So it's important to say that it's not about the warhead, it's about the tail kit. So that, to me, tells you a lot about where we are in our management of stockpile, where we want to go in the future and all that type of stuff. But it clearly also opens up or changes the way that the perception adversaries and even allies can have about what we're up to. And you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be legitimate. It doesn't have to be, written into presidential guidance documents and what have you. It is a perception that is gradually shaping the way countries, look at each other. And I tell you, when we have a crisis like East-West right now, things like these go right into the perception box. This just shows there, it doesn't really matter how far ahead it is. So I think it's really dangerous if we're not clear about why we're doing this. And instead of denying that we're adding capabilities to this weapon system, sort of say, no, this is just like a car that goes into a garage. We paint it and out it comes again. So be honest about the policies and the postures. The other one is about low yield. The other countries, well, I mean, there are no limits on that either. I mean, they're doing what they're doing. I'm sure Russia has a very prolific program on the way to reduce the yields of its weapons as its strike means become more accurate. This is a natural trend in modernization. China, the same thing. It used to have megaton warheads on its ICBMs. Now it's building a new class of ICBMs that are more accurate. They don't have to have huge yield warheads. I don't mean low yield warheads, but lower than the big one. So this is a natural trend. But again, it comes down to, in the end, what is the message that we send with the posture we have and the capability built into it? We keep insisting that declarations are fine, but we have a capability-based deterrent because we cannot afford to rely on countries' nice statements about this and that. We have to look at the capabilities they have, and that is what we plan according to. That's, very strong statements. And so that's how we do it. And so it's about how to make the force equally capable, and if we see something, work around it. And this is the dynamic that's been in nuclear modernization ever since this thing first arrived. So, but I think if we have a policy that wants to change that dynamic, we have to make decisions that are clearly visible, that show that we are changing that direction.
Thanks, Hans.
Short answer, not necessarily. Long answer, you asked, if you don't remember the question, whether if we only had a retaliate after a nuclear attack doctrine, would we still need, or could we get by with fewer of these weapon systems? Not necessarily. And it goes to Bob's question about what's in the bad guy's head. It only matters that the bad guy thinks we'll actually shoot back. What will make him think we'll actually shoot back? It's not about when we'd shoot back. It's about what would convince him that we have a credible plan to respond. If, and I understand there are probably plenty of people in this room totally uncomfortable with the idea that if you have a discrete operational war plan, planning to attack particular targets in a particular nation, I would call that a deterrent, you would call that war fighting. But if I don't have a credible plan for how I will retaliate if I am attacked, then the other guy isn't going to believe that I have a credible plan to retaliate if I'm attacked. So the question of how is different from the question of when. When would you use that plan? That's up to the president. How would you attack if the president said do it? That's what determines which weapons you need. What makes it credible is not when you would use it, but how you would use it.
I could just
Last
add,
comment, Andy.
could I add a couple of remarks on this sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack. We didn't quite make that statement in the 2010 NPR, but the world has changed since then. Libya no longer has chemical weapons. The last one was destroyed on February 2nd of 2014. Successful effort to denude Syria of its large chemical weapons stockpile, 1,300 tons, and now an agreement that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So the world has changed. I think we could easily have a clean declaratory policy that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack against the United States. And I think the risk in places like South Asia that, India's declaratory policy is that a chemical or biological attack could be reason for a nuclear response. Well, that in this day when ISIS is producing and using mustard gas and biological weapons are being pursued, according to the vice commander of SOCOM, by ISIS, that gives non-state actors the potential to initiate a nuclear war, and I think that's dangerous. So I think we should clean that up. And then another comment is, in consulting with allies over the last 6 months in Asia and Europe, they're very concerned in the way we talk about our nuclear modernization. They think it's excessive. They think we talk too much about limited nuclear warfighting scenarios on the periphery of Russia or China. Well, that's where they live. So it might be limited if you live in the continental United States, but if you're in the Baltics or Poland or even Japan, it's your neighborhood. So that's why I think there's a thirst and an opportunity to work together with a coalition of countries, nuclear and non-nuclear, to get us back from what Bill Perry calls the brink, or this tipping point of a potential new qualitative arms race.
Thank you very much, Andy. With that, unfortunately, we have to close the panel. Before giving a round of applause to our speakers, I would just ask you to please stay in your seats. Also, if the speakers would stay up here, because Arms Control Association Executive Director Daryl Kimball is going to provide some closing remarks. And with that, now you can applaud.